I'll take it precisely from there. I think Yanis made some very good points, and I'd like to take us back to the summer of 2015, which is, as you remember, was the high point of the recent Greek crisis. And back then, many economists, a lot of famous economists, including Nobel Prize winners, thought that Grexit was inevitable, and actually some of them even predicted potentially the end of the euro. But as we know, things turned out differently. And I want to take that as my starting point to go back to the history, the economic history of Greece, and to see why were those predictions wrong. I'm going to answer that sometimes economists ignore politics, and the politics of debt are perhaps as important as the economics of debt. There is a very interesting puzzle at the center of Greece's economic life, and this is that even though its economic trajectory appears to be one of uninterrupted financial disasters, existing metrics today show that Greece has done pretty well from where it started, even though it hasn't really completely closed the gap between itself and the most advanced European economies. It is fairly close to them. It belongs to the same group. So how can we reconcile these two different parts of the story? Financial disasters on the one hand, fairly economic achievements, fairly good economic achievements on the other. So there's a very nice paper by Reinhardt and Trebesh that outlines the standard economic story of Greece. It's a paper of going back to 2015, and it goes roughly like this, quoting from the paper. First, the history of Greece is a narrative of debt, default, and external dependence. Second, it's characterized by recurring and persistent cycles of external indebtedness and default. And third, debt and default are perennial themes of Greek history. The conclusion is that there is a 200 years body of evidence to support the view that chronic reliance on external capital has repeatedly led Greece to ruin. So I'd like us to keep in mind those two terms, ruin, and the second term, that the most costly legacy of external debt has been the loss of political control, the theme brought also by Yanis. Keep those two things in mind, and let me make three very quick observations. The first one is that Greece perennially has suffered from a lack of domestic capital. There was access to capital could be acquired through foreign direct investments or external borrowing, and we know the difficulties of generating the former. Now, external borrowing, as we all know, has many risks, but it is a solution to domestic capital scarcity. And so assessing it requires us to analyze the trade-offs that it entails rather than accept it or reject it on the basis of some outcomes. And so the question is, was the trade-off of external borrowing historically worthy for Greece or not? My second observation is that Greece traditionally has been run by ambitious and modernizing elites, very often with a cosmopolitan outlook, that often have strained to generate domestic political support for their ambitious reformist agendas. As a result, sacrificing a measure of national sovereignty in exchange for externally imposed economic discipline was not always perceived by those elites as a pure cost. It was also a means of implementing an otherwise impossible to implement reformist agenda. That's my second observation. So, and my third brief observation is that goes back to the famous J. Paul Getty adage that if you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. If you owe the bank $100 million, that's the bank's problem. And I think it applies perfectly well to Greece, because throughout history, effectively what Greece has done is to use external borrowing as a way to acquire the kind of external leverage that could not be obtained otherwise, not just for fiscal discipline, but also to achieve geopolitical advantage. And this is, I think, no better illustrated by the story that Yanis referred to of the loans that Greeks received during their War of Independence. And I'm going to quote from an unlikely source. This is Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens. He has a very small passage about Greece. It's precisely about the question of loans. And I'm quoting from his book. He writes that in 1821, the Greeks rebelled against the Ottoman Empire. The uprising aroused great sympathy in liberal and romantic circles in Britain, but London financiers saw an opportunity as well. So they proposed to the rebel leaders the issue of tradable Greek rebellion bonds on the London Stock Exchange, and the Greeks would promise to repay the bonds plus interest if and when they won their independence. Private investors bought bonds to make a profit or out of sympathy for the Greek cause, or both. The value of Greek rebellion bonds rose and fell on the London Stock Exchange in tempo with military successes and failures on the battlefields of Greece. The Turks gradually gained the upper hand. With a rebel defeat imminent, the bondholders faced the prospect of losing their trousers, and as a result, their interest was the national interest of Greece, so the British organized an international fleet that in 1827 sank the main Ottoman flotilla in the Battle of Navarino. After centuries of subjugation, Greece was finally free. Now, Harari notes, of course, that freedom came with a huge debt that the new country could not possibly hope to repay. But I think we should take a pause here and note the flip side. Without external support, Greece would not have gained its independence. So external debt in this particular case, and I would argue in future cases as well, shows us that it didn't cause ruin, but regeneration. So losing a measure of political control, my key point is in the case of the economic history of Greece, should not be equated to the terrible economic outcome of economic ruin. And sometimes it could be seen effectively as a trade-off that's acceptable, and perhaps even as an effective political strategy for the country, a country that is and was at its origins extremely poor, devoid of natural resources, devoid of human capital, devoid of access to capital. And I think introducing this more measured image, this balance between politics and economics, allow us in a sense to challenge the standard economic story about Greece, which predicted, wrongly as we now know, Brexit in 2015, and see how things can work in a different direction as well. So thank you very much.